Dozens of people had met this man. They'd hiked with him, eaten with him, shared campsites with him. Some had even taken pictures with him. But when he was found dead near the Appalachian Trail, police discovered something strange. Not one of those people knew his real name. For almost 2 years, thousands of these strangers online tried to figure out who he was. Eventually, they did. But what they found attached to that name changed the entire story. 2 hikers noticed a tent at a small backcountry campsite. They had been there the night before, but the next afternoon, nobody had come out. One of them walked over to check. Inside was a man. He was dead. No identification. But his gear was still there. His food was still there. So, it was more than $3,000 in cash. Nothing suggested he'd been robbed. Then came something harder to explain. Police ran him through every database they had. Nobody was looking for him. No missing person case, no family, no partner, no friend had called it in. Nobody. Which didn't make sense, because this man hadn't been living alone out there. He'd spent months talking to people, eating with them, walking with them, letting them take his picture. So how could someone be known by so many people and missed by no one? Police released his photograph. The responses came almost immediately. People knew him. A lot of people. One hiker remembered sharing dinner with him hundreds of miles north. A woman had walked beside him for most of an afternoon. Someone else remembers sleeping in the same shelter. And a photo surfaced. Then another, and then another. He hadn't been avoiding people at all. For months, he'd been surrounded by them. But every person investigators found knew him by the same name, Miles. That was it. Trail names are common. Nobody had thought twice about it. Miles was easy to talk to, as long as the conversation wasn't about Miles. He'd talk trail, food, gear. Now those throwaway conversations were all investigators had. Then his photo hit social media, and the case took on a life of its own. Groups formed just to identify him. People dug through old phones for photographs they'd forgotten they'd taken. They pulled trail registers, compared dates, tracked down hikers who might have crossed his path. Someone started building a map, and within months, strangers who had never met this man had reconstructed hundreds of miles of his journey, where he slept, who he walked with, where he stopped. They still couldn't find a single person who'd known him before the trail. And the more they searched, the more they cared. Because nearly everyone who remembered Miles had something good to say. He'd shared food when someone's supplies ran low. There were photos of him smiling by shelters. Somewhere along the way, people stopped trying to identify Miles and started trying to explain him. Maybe he'd lost someone. Maybe he'd walked away from a life he hated. Maybe the trail was simply the only home he had left. Nobody knew if any of that was true, but people wanted it to be. Miles became something of a tragic figure, a quiet man who'd walked away from an ordinary life. For almost 2 years, they searched, shared his face, chased every lead, waited for someone, somewhere, to finally recognize him. Then one of those photos reached a woman who knew exactly who he was. She didn't call him Miles. She gave investigators another name, Daniel Mercer. At first, it was just another lead. There had been plenty of those before, but this one held up. All photographs matched. The age matched. The details lined up. Miles finally had a name for the people who spent 2 years searching. This was the moment. Posts went up. People celebrated. Hikers who shared meals and campsites with him finally knew who he'd been. They'd done it. They'd given him his identity back. But a name does something else. It gives you a past. Once investigators started looking into Daniel Mercer's past, the story changed. The first old friend they reached didn't want to talk about him. Another said he'd cut Daniel out of his life years earlier, not a drift, a decision. He said Daniel fixated on people, especially the ones who tried to pull away. When someone told him no, he didn't seem to hear it. Eventually, people just stopped answering his calls. Then investigators found a former girlfriend. She had seen the photos online, read the words people use for miles. Quiet, kind, gentle, helpful. She remembers somebody else. She said Daniel needed to know where she was, who she was talking to, why she hadn't picked up. He checked on her, demanded explanations, showed up after she told him clearly to stay away. Leaving him wasn't simple, she said. She was afraid of what he'd do. Once he realized she meant it, she eventually cut contact completely. Even his family had stopped speaking to him years before he died. They said their relationship had gotten frightening enough. That distance felt like the only safe option. None of it proved Danielle had committed a crime, but it painted a very different picture of the man thousands of strangers had spent 2 years trying to bring home. And the question at the center of the case flipped. For 2 years, people asked, how does a man disappear? Nobody looks for him. They assumed he'd been forgotten, that he had nobody. But maybe Daniel hadn't been forgotten. Maybe people noticed he was gone and had their reasons not to go looking. Maybe some of them were relieved, but the hikers weren't lying. He really did share his food, really did help strangers, really did make people laugh. And the people from Daniel's past weren't necessarily lying either. Maybe he changed out there. Maybe Miles was who he was trying to become. Or maybe it's just easy to be kind to people who don't know anything about what you did before they met you. For 2 years, thousands of strangers wanted to know who Miles was. Eventually, they found out. Daniel Mercer. The hikers knew Miles for hours. The people from his old life knew Daniel for years. Both were sure they knew the real man. Which one would you believe? She left the camera outside her tent to photograph animals. By morning, it had taken 47 pictures. Most were exactly what she had expected, but one of them showed a man. Emma had never seen him before, and when she showed the pictures to a park ranger the next morning, he stopped at the final photograph. He looked at it for a few seconds. Then he asked her one question. Where exactly was this camera last night? Emma had been hiking alone for 4 days. She was experienced, carried the right gear, and always told someone where she planned to stop. She also had a habit of leaving a trail camera near camp to see what moved through the forest at night. That evening, after setting up her tent off the Appalachian Trail, she walked about 50 yards into the trees and strapped the camera to a trunk. It was motion activated. If anything passed in front of it during the night, it would take a picture. She checked the angle, took a quick photo of the setup on her phone, then walked back to camp. She ate, read for a while, and went to sleep. Nothing about the campsite felt unusual. The next morning, the camera showed 47 photographs. The first few were exactly what she'd expected. An empty trail, branches moving in the wind, a deer, a raccoon. Then she reached a photograph taken at 2:13 a.m. There was a man standing between the trees. He was far enough away that she couldn't make out his face. Emma assumed he was another hiker. People occasionally walked at night. Then opened the next one, 2:58 a.m. Now he was only a few feet from the lens, close enough that she should have been able to see his face, but his head was turned. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking to the right. Emma knew what was in that direction, her campsite. For the first time that morning, she looked around. Nothing moved. Her tent was still behind her. Everything looked exactly as she had left it. She told herself there was probably a normal explanation. Another hiker. A strange coincidence. Nothing more. Then she opened the next photograph. 3:17 a.m. This one wasn't of the forest. It was of her tent. Her backpack was visible beside it. Her boots were near the entrance. The small light she'd left hanging inside was still glowing through the fabric. And behind the tent stood the same man. Emma had been inside when that photograph was taken, asleep. She stopped scrolling and started packing. Several hours later, Emma reached the ranger station. At first, she almost didn't show anyone the pictures. The man hadn't attacked her. He hadn't stolen anything. Maybe he'd simply walked through camp. Maybe the photographs made the whole thing look worse than it actually was. Eventually, she handed the camera to one of the rangers. He went through the images, 2:13, 2:58. Then he reached 3:17. He stopped, looked at the picture again, and asked, "Where exactly was this camera last night?" Emma showed him, about 50 yards from her campsite. The ranger asked which direction it had been facing. She showed him that too. Then he looked back at the photograph. Something didn't add up. From the tree Emma had chosen, her tent wasn't visible. There were too many trees in between, but there was a bigger problem. The camera had been pointing in the opposite direction. Emma thought maybe she'd remembered it wrong. Then she remembered the photo she'd taken on her phone when she set it up. She showed him. Same tree, same strap, same angle. The ranger didn't need to explain what that meant. Sometime during the night, somebody had removed the camera from the tree, carried it 50 yards through the forest, brought it close enough to photograph Emma's tent, and then carried it all the way back. He'd returned it to the same tree, pointed it in the same direction Emma had left it, almost as if he didn't want her to know it had ever been moved, except for one thing. He'd left the photograph. That was when Emma remembered something she'd completely forgotten. She had woken up during the night. She didn't know what time. She hadn't checked her phone, but she remembered lying there in the dark because she'd heard something against the outside of the tent. Not footsteps, not an animal. Something moving slowly across the fabric. She remembered thinking it sounded like a branch. She listened, it stopped, and eventually she fell back asleep. When the rangers later returned to the campsite, they noticed something Emma hadn't. There were no low branches close enough to touch the tent. They searched the area. No one was there. The photographs weren't clear enough to identify him, and Emma couldn't describe him. She'd never actually seen his face, at least not while she was awake. Emma went home and stopped hiking alone. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, she stopped expecting an answer. Then one evening, She received a message from an account she didn't recognize. No profile picture, no name she knew, no text, just two attachments. Emma opened the first one. For a moment, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then she recognized the tent. Her tent. The same night. The same light glowing through the fabric. But this wasn't the photograph from her trail camera. It had been taken from the opposite side of the campsite, and it was much closer. Close enough that through the thin fabric, you could see the outline of Emma sleeping inside. The photo had been taken from almost exactly the side of the tent where she'd heard something moving across the fabric that night. Emma stared at it. Then she remembered there was a second attachment. She opened it. This one looked almost completely ordinary. An empty patch of forest in daylight. No man, no tent, no one there at all. It took her a few seconds to recognize the place. It was her campsite, the exact spot where she'd pitched her tent. Except in this photograph, her tent wasn't there yet. Emma checked the date. The picture had been taken 3 days before she arrived, and that was the detail she couldn't explain. Emma hadn't reserved that campsite. She hadn't posted online where she planned to sleep that night. She hadn't even decided to stop there until that afternoon. So how did whoever sent the message know she'd end up there? Had someone been following her along the trail? Had they found something about her online? Maybe she would cross paths with this person before, without ever knowing it. Or maybe he already knew her. And if none of that was true, maybe Emma had never been the target at all. Maybe the man had chosen the campsite first and simply waited for whoever arrived. There was no way to know. The photograph changed one thing. Until that moment, Emma had assumed the story began at 2:13 a.m. when her trail camera first photographed a stranger in the trees. Now she couldn't be sure, because whoever took that daylight photograph had been there 3 days earlier, which meant 2:13 wasn't necessarily the first time he'd seen Emma. It was only the first time Emma's camera had seen him. Claire and Leif were asleep inside their RV when someone started knocking on the roof. It was 2:17 in the morning. They were parked near an empty beach in Virginia. No other cars nearby. No reason for anyone to be standing outside. Then the knocking stopped, and they heard footsteps. Slow, heavy, moving around the RV. The next morning, they found muddy boot prints surrounding the vehicle, but none leading toward it, and none leading away. On the hood, someone had written a single word in white chalk, Croaton. Neither of them knew what it meant, but they'd seen the same word only hours earlier. Claire and Leif had left Petersburg that afternoon in an old Winnebago Claire inherited from her grandfather. They were heading to Virginia Beach for a few nights by the ocean. Traffic delayed them, and by the time they arrived, it was already dark. They parked near Grommet Island Park and walked down to an almost empty beach. On their way back, Liv noticed something written in white chalk across the surfboard of a nearby statue. Most of the letters had rubbed away. She filmed it on her phone. All they could make out was Aichuwatwa. Neither of them thought much about it. They went back to the RV and fell asleep. At 2:17 a.m., the knocking started. 3 hard knocks. Then silence. Claire sat up. Liv was already awake. This time it came from directly above them. The roof, hard enough that they could feel it through the RV. Then came footsteps. Slow, circling the vehicle. They passed one window, then another, then stopped beside them. Through the glass, they could make out the silhouette of a man. He didn't try the door. He didn't look inside. He didn't say a word. He just stood there. Then he raised one hand and pressed his palm against the window. When he finally walked away, a large handprint remained in the condensation. The girls stayed awake until daylight. At 4:21, they stepped outside. That's when they saw the footprints. Large, deep, muddy. They circled the entire RV. Claire followed them, looking for where the man had approached from. There was no trail toward the RV, no trail away from it. The prints existed only around the vehicle, like he'd simply been standing there. Then Liv noticed something on the hood, pieces of white chalk, and one word, Croatoan. Now the damaged word on the statue made sense. The footprints didn't. There was no mud nearby, no swamp, only pavement, sand and ocean. Claire tried to make it rational. Maybe someone had brought a moody boots, put them on beside the RV, walked around it, then taken them off. It sounded ridiculous. Every other explanation sounded worse. Then they searched the word. Within minutes, they found the lost colony of Roanoke. More than 100 English colonists had vanished from a settlement on Roanoke Island centuries earlier. When the settlement was found abandoned, the only thing left behind was one word, Croatoan, and Roanoke Island wasn't far away. They should have driven home. Instead, they went looking for an explanation. That morning, they stopped for breakfast on the way. A man sat alone nearby with a cup of coffee. Claire noticed him because he wasn't glancing at them. He was watching them. Then she saw his boots, covered in dried mud, thick enough that pieces had fallen onto the floor. Claire leaned toward Liv. "Look at his shoes." Liv turned. The man stood up. For a second, Claire thought he was coming toward them. Instead, he walked straight past the table. As he passed Claire, he stopped, just for a second, and quietly said, "You should have gone home," and walked out. His coffee was still on the table, so was the money he'd left beside it. Claire and Liv didn't finish breakfast. Later that morning, they left the RV at a campground and continued on foot. They told themselves they weren't chasing a ghost story. They just wanted to know who had written that word on their vehicle, and how the man in the restaurant had known anything happened at all. They hadn't been walking long when Claire realized Liv was no longer behind her. She stopped. "Liv?" "Nothing." She called again. No answer. Claire retraced their path. Liv couldn't have been more than a minute behind her, but she was gone. Then Claire saw someone standing between the trees. A tall man, watching her. For half a second, she thought it was the man from the restaurant. It wasn't. Claire froze. The man didn't move toward her. He just stared. Then he said, "You came looking." Claire backed away. "What did you do to my friend?" The man tilted his head and then said, "She isn't the one who stayed." Claire heard a sharp crack somewhere behind her. She turned and everything went black. Claire opened her eyes with her head against the steering wheel. She was back inside the Winnebago. Daylight. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then she remembered Liv. Liv? Nothing. Claire checked the back of the RV, the bathroom. Outside, Liv wasn't there. Her backpack was gone. So was her phone. Claire called her. Straight to voicemail. She called again. Nothing. Claire contacted the police. Search teams went through the area where she remembered seeing Liv last. They found nothing, no tracks they could follow, no belongings, no sign of a struggle, no Liv. Claire described the man in the woods. They couldn't find him either. And she told them about the man from the restaurant, the midi boots, the warning. You should have gone home. But by then, he was gone too. No one could tell Claire who either man was or whether they were connected. No one could explain the footprints around the RV or how Liv had disappeared less than a minute after Claire last saw her. The searches continued, but Liv was never found, and neither was the man Claire saw in the woods. And Claire never learned what he meant when he told her, "She isn't the one who stayed."